Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. The views and opinions and technical analysis presented during this webinar are those of Eastman and not necessarily those of UL. The appearance of this content on UL sites does not constitute an endorsement by UL or its affiliates. Today's webinar is Navigating the EU BPA Ban, Essential Insights on Plastic Use in Industrial Food Contact Applications, and is presented by Eastman. Your presenters today are Sophie Ruddick, Market Development Manager, Gary Hawkins, Application Development Associate, and Wim de Oude, Regulatory Affairs Senior. My name is Derek Betcher with UL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Please send us your questions by typing them in the question box located on the bottom of your screen. We are recording today's event, and we'll send you a link by email when it's been posted to ulprospector.com. Now I'd like to hand it over to Sophie. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, thank you very much, Derek, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. We're here today to talk about the EU BPA ban and what that really means for the food processing industry. So during this webinar, we'll provide further details on the new BPA regulation, providing more clarity on definitions and transition periods. And we will also delve deeper into the industrial food processing area to understand which components found on that pieces of equipment are in scope. And then Gary will talk through the benefits of using transparent plastics in your equipment and share how Tritan from Eastman can be the perfect replacement material. So firstly, I'll hand it off to Wim and he'll go through the regulatory topics. Just go to the next slide.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So we will start the regulatory part of this presentation first with a short poll on food contact before we move on. So Derek, can you please up the poll, please? Okay, thanks. As the results come in, let's move on with the presentation. I see that most of the people choose the top answer is really the materials and articles intended to be brought in contact with food. Secondly, anything that is reasonable expected to be in contact with food, and then the direct food contacts materials articles only get still 23% of the votes, and 8% of the people are currently wondering what are the definition and trying to understand what's going what is in contact of or in scope of the BPA ban. So let's move on with the presentation and hope we can get clarity on this for you. So the BPA ban for food contact materials, also known as Regulation 2024 3190, came out last day of last year and is in effect since the 20th of January 25. And this regulation actually prohibits the intentional use of bisphenol A in the production of food contact materials. The regulation covers all food contact materials where the use of BPA may be expected. Think about plastics, coatings, inks, silicones, etc. The full list of food contact materials where use of BPA is expected is in the regulation. Just to give you an example, paper and board is not mentioned in the regulation because bisphenol A is not expected to be used in the production of paper and board materials. Of course, inks and coatings that are intended to be used with paper and board are in scope of the regulation because they fall under the coatings and inks parts of the regulation. Additionally, the regulation also prohibits the use of hazardous bisphenols unless they are authorized. Applications for such authorizations can be submitted to EFSA, but currently the information requirements for such application are not known yet, and EFSA is required an opinion on that latest in January 27, so about 1.5 years from now. So moving. So what dates are important for this regulation? So moving on to the standard transition period of this regulation has been defined to be 18 months, so till 20th of July 26. In principle, this transition period is valid for all materials using bisphenol A, unless the use has been exempted or derogated. and a longer transition period is defined. That longer transition period is a period of 36 months, so 3 years, till 20th of January 28. The uses that receive this longer transition period are single-use materials used for fruits, vegetable, and fishery products. Typically, that are the packaging materials for these food groups. The reason is that those foods are typically packed in during a short period of the year, and the longer transition period would allow for better stock management of non-compliant materials, avoiding them to be wasted. BPA coating on the external side of metal cans is also part of the longer transition periods due to the limited exposure that is expected from that application, and alternatives are still in development. An important one, repeat use articles for professional food equipment has received a longer transition period, as that equipment consists of multiple parts that are typically specifically designed for that use, and the replacement of a material would potentially require redesign of that part or qualification that requires a long time for the change to make. Some examples for repeat use materials that receive a longer transition period are parts like seals, pumps, confectionery molds, flanges, side glasses, etc. The transition periods are to be understood to be the latest dates at which a food contact material made with bisphenol A can be first placed on the EU market. So additionally, single-use materials, so packaging, need to be filled with food within 1 year of the applicable transition period, and the packed food may be sold until the stock is exhausted or the due date of the food is reached. Repeat use articles placed on the market before the applicable deadlines may remain on the market for 1 year after that applicable deadline, so either July 27 or January 29. That 1 year measure is to prevent a large buildup of stock at resellers or distributors, as they will have only 1 year to clear their stocks and are then not allowed to resell the materials anymore. Just as a quick remark on the transition period, Article 12.3 that regulates the 1 year destock period for repeat use articles contains a mistake, and currently allows repeat use materials with transition period till July 2026 to also remain on the market till January 2029, and not as expected July 2027. This is not in line with, if you look at the regulation, with recital 22 of the regulation, and the European Commission is also currently preparing a regulation that will correct this mistake. That publication of that regulation is expected by the end of this year. So moving along to our next slide. So how did the industry respond? So like all stakeholders, the industry had the chance to comment and provide insights to the EU Commission on the preparation phase of this regulation. In response to industry concerns, the EU Commission has limited the scope of this regulation to the intentional use of bisphenol A and hazardous bisphenols, and not the presence of bisphenol A in the final food contact material. We come to that later. While the intentional use of BPA is prohibited, the unintentional use is actually not prohibited, and is not unintentional presence of BPA in the food contact materials not in scope of the regulation and not prohibited. Also, there are no monitoring schemes for the presence of BPA in foods or in food contact materials asked to the industry. Additionally, several users have given a longer transition period up to 3 years, as we explained in the previous slide. And there are also 2 applications where the 2 uses where the industry could show that the exposure to BPA is limited or non-existent, that the likelihoods of BPA-free alternatives to be developed within the next 3 years are limited, and they were already granted an extended authorized use of BPA. So those applications are the use of bisphenol A in polysulfone membranes for filtration membranes, and use of bisphenol A in epoxy coatings for self-supporting food contact materials with a capacity of 1,000 liters. So that includes coated vessels, coated large reactors, etc. Those derogated uses, authorized uses, will require every 5 years a dossier to be provided to the EU Commission to show the progress made on replacement of those products with alternatives, if any, and based on the dossier, an extension for the next 5 years can be made, or the industry is asked to switch to BPA-free alternatives. So, how do these transition periods work in practice, especially when there's uncertainty which transition period is applicable? The most important question to ask is basically, if I start preparing today with my inventory of affected materials, will I be ready to switch by July 2026 or not? If yes, it's likely to the best approach to make the switch by that due date, unless it's clearly proven that the application belongs to one of the users with a longer deadline. If the answer to the question is no, or it's not known, because we still are in the preparation process, we still need to ask BPA-free statements from our suppliers. We may need to redesign, we may need to do qualifications, etc. You or your legal representative may want to come up with some justification, especially when it's not completely clear from the regulation to which transition period you may belong, to justify the longer transition period, why a longer transition period is necessary. Either way, we do recommend to stay on top of this game. Do not wait until the very last moment, but start reviewing your portfolio and planning the transition now, because the deadlines are short. July 26 is not very far away anymore. So, moving on also to the results of the poll that we started in the beginning. So what actually is food contact, and which products will be in scope of the BPA regulation and may need to be replaced? So what are food contact materials actually? So the definition is in threefold and very broad. So all materials intended to be brought in contact with foods are in scope. Of course, materials that are already in contact with food are in scope, but also materials reasonably expected to be brought in contact with foods are also in scope. So that makes that definition very broad. And all of those materials, when the potential is there to be made from BPA, are in scope of this regulation. So some of these materials are very obvious, of course, like food packaging, kitchenware, etc. That's all food contact materials. Some might be less clear, napkins, paper towels, but also guards of food processing equipment that are typically not in contact with food all the time, but can be reasonably expected to be brought in contact with food during their lifetime, are all in scope of this regulation. How do you assess compliance, especially in the supply chain? So as said before, the regulation prohibits the intentional use of bisphenol A. So that does mean that all food contact does that mean that all food contact materials need to be measured for the presence of bisphenol A? Not really. It may not be necessary. The the regulation prohibits the intentional use of bisphenol A, as said. So the unintentional use of bisphenol A, for example, in recycled materials or traces that came through contamination, are not in scope of this regulation and are in principle not prohibited to enter the supply chain. In principle, a declaration of the supplier should that shows that no BPA has been used in the production of our food contact materials, and they can also prove this to the competent authorities through the supporting documentation, makes that the material can be compliant with the regulation. The requirement to have a declaration of compliance is actually something new for many food contact materials that fall under this regulation, because currently at the European Union level, only the plastics have the requirement for a declaration of compliance. But all other food contact materials don't have this. This regulation will change that, and for many food contact categories, a declaration of compliance will be needed. And that's very new for those applications and for those food contact materials. Currently, there's no layout requirements for this regulation or for this declaration of compliance, but the information requirements can be found in Annex 1 of in Annex 3 of the regulation. In case bisphenol A is used in the production of food contact materials, of course, this needs to be mentioned in the declaration of compliance, and also a sentence that the material is in compliance with the regulation is needed. For those materials, an additional compliance step may be required. So, for example, testing, compliance testing to verify that the quantitative or migration limit of BPA that's mentioned in the regulation so I think my connection dropped for a second. So this regulation changes the requirements for declaration for all the food contact materials as mentioned. There are no information requirements, but in case bisphenol A is used, the compliance verification is required, and it can be either done through migration testing or quantitative testing, showing that the 1 parts per billion limit that is in this regulation is not exceeded. But other ways of proving the compliance with the regulation, for example, migration modeling or worst case calculation that clearly show that the bisphenol A migration stays below the limit, can be acceptable as well. Moving on to other hazardous bisphenols, because in the last few slides I mainly talked about bisphenol A, but the regulation also regulates other hazardous bisphenols. Of course, the question then becomes which bisphenols are currently in scope of the regulation. Well, there are 4 that are classified as hazardous under this regulation, and hazardous means that they are classified as a carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotox substance class 1A or 1B, or if they have endocrine disrupting properties category 1 for human health. So far, in scope of this regulation are both bisphenol S and 2,2-bis-4-hydroxyphenyl 4-methylpentane, which are both classified as according to both have a harmonized classification according to the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation as a reprotox 1B. And very new, only since September 1st, bisphenol AF and tetrabromo bisphenol A have also been harmonized classified, respectively as a reprotox 1B and a carcinogenic substance 1B, and are also now in scope of this regulation. Just to mention, bisphenol F is on the horizon because this substance received an ECHA opinion regarding a harmonized classification as a carcinogen 1B. For now, this is not regulated as such yet, but the chances are significant that once the entire process is gone through, that this substance will also receive a harmonized classification as a carcinogen 1B. Once that classification becomes active after the transition period, this bisphenol will also be in scope of the regulation. What does that mean, that these hazardous bisphenols also become in scope of the regulation? In principle, for plastics, only bisphenol S should be of a concern, because bisphenol S is the only bisphenol besides bisphenol A that was listed on the positive list of the plastics regulation, and has, based on this regulation, been removed. The other bisphenols were never on the positive list, should not be used in plastics, and can only be used in non-plastic food contact materials. For now, these bisphenols can continue to be used as such, because the Commission first needs to publish the authorization for their continued use. Until that has happened, they can be used as is. And it will take quite some time, the expectations, before the Commission will publish these kind of authorizations, because EFSA, the European Food and Safety Authority, will first need to publish an opinion on the information requirements for the applications of the authorization. This will not happen before early 2027. And afterwards, businesses will then have 9 months to submit their application for authorization. And after they have received the applications, EFSA and the Commission both will need to form an opinion and provide and grant the final authorization. The timeline for this has not been specified, but is likely to take some years. And during all this time, the hazardous bisphenol can remain in use, but it's obvious that at some point in time it will need to be phased out and replaced, because also, even if an authorization is granted, it will be granted for periods of 5 years, and after each 5 year, a analysis of alternatives will need to be presented to the Commission, showing that the substance is still that there's still no alternative available. The moment an alternative becomes available, the Commission may choose to revoke the authorization and remove that from this regulation. So it is very advisable to follow up how, over time, the status of the hazardous bisphenols will evolve, because also other bisphenols may become in scope of this regulation, except for the 4 or 5 that are now in scope. And it may be advisable to not be late at the game and miss a deadline. So we do recommend a proactive approach when dealing with these other hazardous bisphenols. With that, I give it over to you, Sophie, for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wim. So we're going to start with another poll for the audience now. So Derek, if you could bring that up. So I'd like the audience to tell me from the list below, which of the following applications do you think fall into the BPA ban? So you can select multiple options, but just interested to hear what you think is applicable from the list below. Okay, I see some responses coming in. Very interesting responses. So what I'm going to slides and see if they help to clarify whether the applications listed are actually in scope or not. So bisphenol A is found in lots of applications. I know Vin went through a lot of them, including epoxy resins for lining metal cans and storage tanks, in polycarbonate plastics used in food moldings, water bottles, and some food processing equipment, as well as components such as inks and adhesives. What we see is a high percentage of food equipment for industrial food is produced with 316 food grade stainless steel. However, there are many plastic components also found within food processing equipment. On this slide, you can see a lot of the opaque plastic components. This includes like conveyor belts, which are typically made from PVC, PTFE, or polyurethane. You've got guardrails and scraper blades. They're mostly made out of POM or acetal with the brand name Delrin, or nylons. And then you've got seals, gaskets, and bearings, which are generally like PTFE, POM, or nylon as well. These components are generally either colored blue or white, which makes them much easier to identify in case like there's any breakages. They're easier to find within the food products. And these materials are typically not made from bisphenol A and therefore are not affected by the BPA ban. However, there are some clear components found in food production equipment, components such as confectionery molds. These are generally clear to ensure that the parts are filled correctly with minimal bubbles, and once the product is set, it can be easily removed. You've got protective guards, sight glass windows. These are used to protect operators from either high heat, sharp machinery, but also allows you to monitor the production with the clarity to ensure you've got high quality and safety. And then you've got food covers, which are used with machines with moving parts, where there may be a chance for food splashback, as well as protecting the food from dust or contamination. So these clear components are generally made with 3 types of plastic materials. You've got polycarbonate, which is typically referred to as Lexan or the Macrolon brand. You've got PETG, and you've got acrylic, PMMA, which is typically the brand's plexiglass or perspex. So if you see that any of these components are made from polycarbonate, then these would be affected by the BPA ban and would need to be replaced. So we've heard from the market that there is a perception that some components may not be in scope. And it's ultimately the end user's decision on what components are affected. But one of the key questions you should ask yourself is, do your clear plastic components currently require food contact compliance? Polycarbonate will lose its food contact status due to this ban. So those components that need food contact status and are currently using polycarbonate today will need to be replaced in the future. Within every aspect of food production, companies need to assess the risks. Food safety and hygiene is paramount, so understanding the likelihood that food will come into contact with these guards will determine that need for change. And if you remember that key principle, if it can, it will. That will help you in understanding which components may be at risk. So I wanted to give a few examples of where clear plastic components are used. So Derek, if you could bring up this video. So here we've got a meat mixer where, as you can see, this clear guard, as the operator brings it down, is used to prevent moisture from entering the bowl, as well as protect from sharp knives. As you can see from that video, there was a potential risk of the food in the mixer getting into contact with that guard. So I would interpret that this component needs to be food contact approved. And if it is made with polycarbonate, it would need to be changed. A second example, here I've used this photo of an operator cleaning the equipment down during a shift. The cloth that she's using now, she may be used to wipe down different pieces of machinery, including those clear guards that are behind her. This would be a case where the guards would be reasonably expected to be in contact with food, and therefore would need to be food contact approved. So what applications are already evaluating alternatives to polycarbonate? As you can see on the left of the slide, we've got confectionery molds such as chocolate molds, and that's been a key focus area with chocolate processors supported by their suppliers. They're currently evaluating different materials, both from injection molded and extruded forms, to try to meet the BPA ban deadline. And these have been determined to be quite challenging parts to replace, so that transition deadline has been extended to the January 2028 deadline. Material properties for chocolate molds includes toughness, heat resistance, and chemical resistance to cleaning agents and those chocolate ingredients. Validation testing is ongoing, including with Eastman's Tritan copolyester. On the right, the second application I want to talk about is the large bulk water bottles used for water coolers in commercial and residential properties. Here, companies are working towards a July 2026 deadline to position an alternative material to polycarbonate with these products. With this application, existing polycarbonate bottles can still be used until the end of their service life. Bottles can be either extrusion blow molded or injection stretch blow molded, and the materials need to be clear, durable, have good heat and UV stability, as these can be stored outdoors, and have high melt strength to be able to blow the bottle of that size with a handle. Again, validation testing is ongoing, including with Eastman's Tritan copolyester. So now I'll pass over to Gary and he'll talk more about the materials.
Thank you, Wim. Thank you, Sophie. So, how did we get to the use of transparent plastics in this industry? And it really starts from a sense of history. So, we want to review that with you a little bit today. So, back in the late 1800s, polycarbonate was invented in Germany. And of course, they found that the properties are quite unique, very temperature resistant, tough material, very clear, can also be made opaque. And but there was very little application known for a need for that plastic at the time. So back in the 50s, the 1950s, what you actually see is that they were able to scale up the polycarbonate. They were able to patent the materials, and early adoption started mainly in type of electronics and connector industries. And then in the 1960s, what we actually see is that the public becomes very interested in having convenience and pre-processed foods. And so at the same time, there was a lot of people moving from metals due to contamination into glass, but then there was glass breakage issues throughout the world as we were trying to ship these food products across the globe. So this drove the industry to try to turn to, at least on the primary packaging, the use of plastics. And BPA-derived polycarbonate was the clear leader. It was determined to be safe, had very good properties. And so in the 1970s, you really see that polycarbonate became not only the primary plastic container, but also the primary plastic used for guards, covers, et cetera, that we've been talking about so far. And in the 2000s, due to the concerns with BPA, we actually see that a lot of companies, including Eastman, spent time researching alternatives, safer alternatives to polycarbonate. And that's what I want to talk to you about next. So where do these transparent plastics actually fit into this industry? And what we see is that it gives, the transparent materials actually gives the best balance of properties between metal and glass. So if you think about what would be important for these protective covers and guards, clarity or the ability to see the product would be very important. Durability, of course, would be important. Ease of fabrication would be important. Noise reduction would be important. Light weighting, of course. How easy is the material to clean would become important. Chemical resistance is important because of the way these substances and surfaces are cleaned. Food contact, of course, is important. Being free of materials or substances of concern would be important. And of course, being able to detect the material should it break off or get into the food product becomes important. Heat resistance is also an important item here, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the future. I just want to kind of highlight the areas where metal, and this is probably pretty obvious, and glass aren't very suitable in this area. So, of course, metals aren't clear. They can be perforated so that you can see the food product, inspect the food product. But in most cases, you're talking about a limited ability to do that inspection and ensure that there's good quality there. Metals aren't easy to fabricate with. They, of course, are not lightweight. Glass is a really good alternative. It improves the viewability that we were just talking about, but it has the issues of not being very durable, not being able to easy to fabricate with. It really translates noise instead of becoming a noise blocking agent. So it doesn't give noise reduction properties, and it's not lightweight, and it's not easily detected. So this is why the industry really turned towards transparent plastics, which for the most part meet all of these criteria. The areas where there are some challenges, of course, is now we're talking about substances of concern like BPA. Some of those plastics are not compliant now. And then in some cases, they're harder to detect because they are still transparent. Now, the good thing about plastics is that you can actually put in taggants which allow you to determine whether or not they've been placed into the food product by mistake. It's just now you probably would need to use a different type of detector other than just a metal detector to pick those up. So this is why really the industry has turned towards plastics as a solution. So again, remember in the 2000s, a lot of companies began doing research on alternatives to BPA polycarbonate, and Eastman was one of those companies. And so for greater than 15 years, we actually see that one of the materials of choice here in this industry and others has been Tritan. It is BPA-free. It is considered food contact safe. We have the ability to increase the sustainability of this material by adding molecular recycled content. It is chemically resistant, temperature resistant, transparent, and it is shatter resistant as well. So this material has been accepted everywhere around the world as a material of choice and a safe material, and it provides a lot of the same benefits or exceeds the benefits that are required by polycarbonate. Here's some more information about that. So if you look for materials of concern, of course, BPA is quite a bit of what we're talking about so far. Polycarbonate materials certainly have the BPA in them, and so those are now going to need to be avoided in the near future. You see acrylic materials, which are right now accepted from this standpoint, but one of the cautions here is the monomers used in making acrylic materials are already banned in uses for pharmaceuticals, dental, and medical applications. So it's reasonable to believe that acrylic sheeting would also become a material of concern in the near future. And then you have a PETG type materials and Tritan materials. And the PETG and Tritan, of course, are free of these materials of concern and are food contact approved. You can see that across the board, though, the Tritan product that I'm introducing to you now is a material that gives the best balance of properties and is still a safe alternative to polycarbonate. Each material has kind of been selected. We talked about polycarbonate a lot a minute ago. It had the best through the 70s into the early 2000s, had the best properties, was considered safe. PMMA is often selected because of its abrasion resistance, because a lot of these surfaces get scrubbed, but you have the other issues to deal with that are pointed out here. PETG is a material that's used in certain cases. It has a good balance of properties in terms of safety, chemical resistance. What it's really used for is easy fabrication. And then you've got the Tritan Renew material that offers that molecular recycling and has probably the best balance of properties for what's needed for this industry. One of the things that Tritan Renew and Tritan have been known for years is their toughness. So the first photo that you see there on the left upper quadrant of the slide is actually a food container that's being driven over by a vehicle. And so when this happens to a Tritan container, what we actually see is that the Tritan material, of course, deforms in terms of the original shape, but it does not shatter. So it's extremely tough, even when you run over it by a vehicle like a car or a truck. You can see here we've got some notched IZOD and some instrumented impact data that further shows Tritan's toughness. And this toughness occurs not only in thick sheets, whereas there's a problem with polycarbonate, but also occurs at cold temperatures. So very good toughness throughout the temperature regime that we see being used in food contact surfaces and food processing facilities. So Tritan really maintains its clarity and impact strength even in these harsh environments that we see and the humidities that are seen in food processing plants. So everyone probably already recognizes that there's a danger zone for food products. So typically food processing plants are either held at 4C or below or above 60C to prevent any microbes from growing inside the food product. So this means that the plastics that are used have to be compliant in those temperature zones as well. So really, most processing is done at a hot temperature. Then parts of the plant are either held at these very cold temperatures or warm temperatures. And each one of those processing areas inside a food processing plant is at those same temperatures to prevent those microbes from growing. And of course, there's humidity present. So when temperature and humidity are both present and the materials are amorphous and clear, they have a tendency to physically age and also lose some of their properties. Now, the chart on the right kind of exemplifies that. So when primal meats are cut, there's a device, a cutter, if you would, where one half of the cutting blade is cooled by a cooling medium. It's sealed off, and then the clean side, the food contact side, is actually brought in contact with these primal cuts of meat. So you can think about very big chunks of beef or some other meat product. Sometimes this is bone in, which means the saw has to cut through all of that at a very fast pace. So in this case, what happens is a cooling fluid is blended with water, and this container, this area where this cutting occurs and the blades are kept cool, is typically at about 45C when you think about how fast the blades are turning, as well as the temperature of the facility that it's in. It's about 45C. So the Technical University of Berlin in March of this year, independent of Eastman, came up with these results. And basically what they found was that polycarbonate windows that are used to observe these blades to make sure the blades are still spinning and still sharp, there's no problems with the blades. Those little windows were hazing and cracking, and they were approached by the industry to find out why. And so they actually, independent of Eastman, made the suggestion that the industry switch to Tritan because of the phenomenon that you see here. So over time, a period of time in contact with water, in contact with this cooling fluid, and in contact with this temperature, you see that the polycarbonate material actually begins to lose its very good impact strength. So why does all this matter? Well, in addition to the facilities either being at hot or cold temperatures, you have to worry about the cleaning process. So food processing plants have to be aggressively cleaned, and we say here daily. In some cases, it's more than once per day, depending on if there are transitions between food products. And when something gets cleaned, it's the entire plant. It's the floor, it's the conveyor belts, it's the plastic materials that you see used in the food processing. And in some cases, they're subject to hot water or steam. So you're talking about temperatures greater than 82C over a specified period of time. Aggressive cleaners are used to make sure that microbes and fungi are destroyed. And of course, we just talked about physical aging that occurs of the material, and a lot of scrubbing occurs during this cleaning process. So the materials also need to be resistant to abrasions, and you don't want them to cloud up, because that's why these clear plastics are used, so that you can better view the quality of the food products. And again, this occurs possibly many times in a shift in a food processing plant. So because these plastic guards are typically affixed or thermoformed or in a shape, they typically have stress inside of them. And when you combine that stress with these cleaning agents and these high temperatures, it can cause cracks and failures. And so what we see here is a chart of impact retention between the common materials that we see used in these guards and covers versus the chemicals that are typically used in these aggressive cleaners. So the most common families are IPA, so alcohol, chlorine-based cleaners, quat cleaners, which are ammonium-based compounds, iodophores, PAA, which is a form of acid, or hydrogen peroxide. And so what we're looking at here is how does the material retain its impact after a stress is applied and they're in contact with these chemicals for 24 hours. And you can see that Tritan does a very good job of retaining its impact strength regardless of the chemical that was applied under this strain. PETG does a fairly good job, except when you're considering alcohols. The yellow part of the chart actually means that there could be an issue, so be cautious. Green means that we believe and our customers have found that the material is safe for use. And any red zones means there could be fast damage to the product, which should be avoided. And so you can see that polycarbonate and PMMA either have red or yellow areas of concern when coming in contact with these kinds of chemicals. And on the right-hand side of this diagram, what you can actually see is what happens with putting these substances or these plastics into contact with Firex TB, which is a quatiphore cleaning material. Each one of these plastics has been screwed into a place of another plastic, kind of how it would be fabricated in a machinery or food processing technique, and all were tightened to the same level of torque. And then they were in contact with this Firex TB for 48 hours. And what you can see is that, again, Tritan has no cracking or shattering, no environmental stress crack resistance issues, but you do see issues with polycarbonate, general purpose polycarbonate, and acrylic. So in closing of my section, I just want to point out that Tritan Renew is a very good alternative to polycarbonate. It is useful for these types of environments. It's chemically resistant, but we still wanted, Eastman wants to be the kind of company that improves the environment and allows people to use recycled content. Circular economies are preferred over linear economies. And so we're offering Tritan Renew, which has this molecular recycled content up to 90%. And it is ICC plus certified for that content, so that customers who want a sustainable solution can feel confident that they're getting a product that will not only meet their needs with very few compromises in these challenging environments, but be sustainable. So I'm turning it back over to Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. So what are the key takeaways? Companies need to start looking at alternatives to BPA now as the transition deadlines get closer. And remembering that key question, is it reasonably possible to replace your parts made with BPA by July 2026? If not, you need to start working on that justification for derogation. We believe that clear protective guards can be reasonably expected to be in contact with food during normal use, and therefore these components need to be replaced if they contain BPA. Food production companies need to perform these risk assessments on each piece of equipment to determine that compliance. And then Tritan Renew is the perfect replacement material for polycarbonate in food guards. With the compelling data that Gary shared on chemical resistance, the shatter resistance, and hydrolytic stability to withstand those harsh cleaning environments. We really hope that the webinar gave you a clearer understanding of how the BPA ban affects the food processing industry, and also share that Eastman can support you during that transition period in evaluating alternatives. So if any of these topics raised today resonate with you, let's discuss it further. So thank you very much again for your time, and we'll open up to questions now. So thanks, Derek.
Perfect. And just as a reminder to the audience, the question box is located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We'll get through as many as we can, so feel free to post your questions there. And if we don't get to yours, representatives from Eastman will reach out after the webinar to help address those questions. The first one I have here is for Wim. What about medicines? For example, a factory that manufactures cough syrup and uses non-BPA-free plastic bottles for the primary packaging.
Thanks, Derek. So in principle, medicines are not in scope of this regulation because the regulation clearly talks about food contact materials, not medicines. However, it may be good to note that the hazards that have led to this BPA ban in food contact materials probably should be covered with risk assessment in the medical space, showing that the continued use is still safe. So not in scope, but medicine producers may want to have a look at this and see if the risk assessments are still up to date.
And then what about the plastic materials for potable water contact regarding the EU regulation?
Potable water is actually kind of same as medicine. So potable water is currently regulated under the European Drinking Water Directive. BPA is listed on the positive list for materials in contact with drinking water, but with an expiration date of December 31, 2028. So until that time, BPA can be used based on the listing of this positive list. For its continued listing on the positive list for drinking water materials, a application will be needed to extend that time. The requirements have been published in 2024, and the first applications can start as of next year to be ready for that deadline of December 31st, 2028. So not in scope, but listed on the European Drinking Water Directive.
Perfect. And then Sophie, this one's for you. PC macrolon is opaque and not transparent. Can that be impacted?
Yes, so I did go through more the transparent plastics in this webinar, but if the macrolon or polycarbonate is opaque, it is also in scope for the BPA regulation, yes.
Okay. And then, Wim, here's another one for you. Assuming a paper dispenser used in food preparation area that contains a clear BPA top used to cut the paper when it is used, is that within the scope of this ban? There is a slight risk, I assume, of transfer from the dispenser to the paper, which is definitely then in scope.
Thank you, Derek, for the question. It's a tough one, but in principle, the BPA on the paper is not intended to be there, so it's not used in the production of the paper. It's there as an intentional contact with that, or as an contact with that dispenser, and it's not intended to enter into the food chain. So in principle, it can be argued that that particular use is out of scope of this regulation, because this regulation really talks about the intentional use of bisphenol A, and that's not applicable to the paper of this dispenser. It then becomes really a personal or a company justification, or a company setup to accept that risk, yes or no.
And then, Wim, are there other materials within scope like PSU, PPSU?
PSU and PPSU, so the polysulfones family, can be made with bisphenol S, and as explained in the presentation, bisphenol S is in scope of this regulation. It still needs to go through the entire authorization approach, so it's still some years down the line, but certainly PSU can be can be in scope of this regulation if made with bisphenol S. There are certain grades that are not made with any of these bisphenols that are currently in scope of the regulation. So really requesting information from the supplier on this regulation and the scope is critical for these materials that can or cannot be in scope, really depending on the exact monomers that have been used.
And then Sophie, I think this one's for you. Are PPE-like safety eyewear concerned by this BPA ban? And does Eastman have alternatives to PC with BPA that may fit?
Safety eyewear. I think that's a very good question. I think it really depends on how they're being used in food production lines, and I think the customer would have to do their own risk assessment to see if there are events where it could be reasonably likely to be in contact with food. I can't give that judgment yes or no. I don't know if Vim has a comment, but in terms of Eastman's alternatives, yes, we do have alternatives to polycarbonate for safety eyewear. So we can reach out after this to discuss more.
Okay. And then Gary, I think I'm going to throw this one over to you. Is Tritan Renew food contact approved due to PCR content, or has it been depolymerized and purified to a version grid?
So the non-recycled versions of Tritan have food contact, as well as the ones that contain molecular recycled post-consumer content. And in either case, what's happening, so in the case of the recycle it, what we're actually able to do is depolymerize the material and re-react monomers to recreate the products. And so in this case, it essentially is the same as a fossil fuel based version of the product, but much lower greenhouse gas emissions. Lower energy is required to do that because you're not starting all the way back at a fossil fuel to make that happen. So both actually have food contact approval, not just the PCR versions.
Perfect.
Hopefully that's clear.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we had for questions. I wanted to thank you again for attending today's webinar. Just as a reminder, we will be sending you a link to the recording of today's webinar so you can watch it at any time and share it with others at your company. A representative from Eastman will reach out to you in regards to your questions. Thank you again for attending, and we hope you have a great day.